Imagine a world where every single thread in your clothing was twisted into existence by a human hand. If you look at your shirt right now, you are seeing millions of tiny fibers locked together in a tight spiral, a feat of engineering we take for granted every time we get dressed. In our modern age, fabric is so abundant that we rarely stop to consider the sheer volume of labor required to produce it. For most of human history, creating that thread was the slowest and most grueling part of making anything, a bottleneck that dictated the pace of life for entire civilizations. It was a constant, exhausting struggle against the physical limitations of the human body. This is the story of a simple wooden machine that broke that bottleneck and changed the world works forever. It is a story about how a single realization in a small English cottage rippled outward to transform global economies and the very nature of human work. Welcome to a new series where we explore the most important technical advancements in history. We are not just looking at the inventions themselves, but at the practical stories of why they happened and how they actually worked. We want to understand the constraints that held people back, the breakthroughs that shattered those limits, and the ways these ideas scaled up to touch the lives of everyone on the planet. This is a journey through the guts of history, focusing on the moments when human cleverness met a desperate need and created something entirely new. To understand where we are going, we have to look closely at the mechanical DNA of our world, starting with the humble origins of the textile industry. Before the middle of the 1700s, the production of cloth was a slow and quiet affair. It was a cottage industry, which meant it literally happened inside people's homes. This was a decentralized system where the rhythm of production followed the rhythm of the household. If you walked through a small village in the countryside, you would hear the rhythmic thrum of spinning wheels and the clatter of hand looms coming from open windows. It was a family business where everyone had a role, and the survival of the unit depended on everyone performing their specific task. The men usually did the heavy weaving on large, cumbersome looms that took up much of the living space, while the women and children spent almost every waking hour spinning raw wool or cotton into yarn. This was not a hobby or a side craft. It was the primary economic engine of the era, yet it was an engine that was constantly sputtering. The problem was that the math of making clothes was completely broken. It took about 5 or 6 spinners to keep a single weaver supplied with enough yarn to stay busy. This meant that for every person sitting at a loom, an entire small crowd of people had to be spinning constantly just to provide the raw material. Weaving was a relatively fast process, especially as new techniques improved the speed of the loom, but spinning remained a nightmare of efficiency. To make a single thread, you had to pull out a small clump of fiber, stretch it just right, and twist it while the wheel spun. This required immense focus and tactile sensitivity. If you pulled too hard, the thread snapped and had to be laboriously rejoined. If you did not pull enough, the thread was lumpy and weak, which would cause it to fail later during the weaving process. It was a delicate, one-handed operation that could only produce one single strand of yarn at a time. The spinner was the ultimate bottleneck in the global supply chain of the 18th century. This imbalance created a massive pressure on the entire system. Weavers were constantly sitting idle, waiting for the spinners to catch up. They were hungry for work and eager to produce more cloth to sell, but the technology of the spinning wheel was a hard ceiling that no one knew how to crack. As the population grew and the demand for cheap textiles rose, this gap between the speed of weaving and the speed of spinning became a crisis. People were working as hard as they possibly could, their fingers calloused and their backs aching, but they were trapped by the physical limits of their own 2 hands. The world wanted more cloth, but the traditional spinning wheel simply could not give any more. The entire economy was waiting for someone to find a way to multiply the output of a single human being. Everything changed in the 1760s because of a simple observation. The story goes that a man named James Hargreaves was in his home when a traditional spinning wheel was accidentally knocked over on its side. As the wheel continued to spin on the floor, he noticed that the spindle, which was now pointing straight up into the air, was still turning. This seems like a minor detail, but for someone who lived and breathed the mechanics of spinning, it was a revelation. In that moment, he had a flash of insight that would change the trajectory of the industrial world. He realized that the horizontal orientation of the traditional wheel was actually a constraint. If the spindles were vertical instead of horizontal, he could line up a whole row of them side by side. He did not need a new worker for every spindle. He just needed a way to drive them all from a single source of power. This was the birth of the spinning jenny. It was a relatively simple machine, made mostly of wood, but its internal logic was revolutionary. Instead of a single spindle producing one thread, his first machine had 8. The design was ingenious in its simplicity. A person would turn a large wheel with one hand, which would spin all 8 spindles at once. With the other hand, they would move a wooden carriage back and forth to draw out the fibers. This carriage mimicked the delicate motion of the human hand, pulling and stretching the cotton rovings before the spinning spindles twisted them into finished yarn. In an instant, the productivity of a single human being had been multiplied by 8. The machine had taken the complex, instinctive motions of a skilled worker and translated them into a series of gears and sliding wooden parts. This was the scaling trick that nobody talks about. It was not just about making a machine that was faster, it was about changing the ratio of labor. Suddenly, one person could do the work that previously required nearly 10 people. But the breakthrough was even more practical than that. The spinning jenny was small enough to fit inside a person's home. It did not require a massive power source like a river or a steam engine in its early days. It was a piece of technology that could be adopted by the same families who were already working in the cottage industry. It was a democratic invention in its first iteration, allowing individual workers to drastically increase their own output without needing to build a massive factory or find a new source of energy. As word of this machine spread, it caused a wave of both excitement and terror. For the weavers, it was a miracle. Finally, they had enough yarn to work at full capacity. The bottleneck was gone, and the price of yarn began to drop, making cloth cheaper for everyone. But for the traditional spinners, the machine was a threat to their very survival. They looked at the spinning jenny and did not see progress. They saw the end of their livelihoods. If one machine could do the work of 8 people, what would happen to the other 7? This was the first great anxiety of the industrial age. In some places, angry workers broke into homes and destroyed the machines, fearing that this new technology would leave them with no way to feed their families. They were terrified that the machine would devalue their human skills, turning a craft they had practiced for a lifetime into something a child could do by. Despite the resistance, the momentum of efficiency was impossible to stop. The spinning jenny was the first major step in what we now call mechanization. Once people saw that you could multiply human effort with a simple arrangement of wheels and belts, the race was on. Very quickly, the 8 spindles became 16, then 32, and eventually 80. The machines grew too large and too expensive for a single family to own, and they began to move out of the cottages and into specialized buildings. The era of the lone craftsman working at a kitchen table was beginning to fade, replaced by a new way of organizing human effort. This transition was the start of the factory system. When you have a machine that can produce massive amounts of thread, you need a way to organize the flow of raw materials in and the finished product out. You need a centralized place where workers come to the machines, rather than the machines being in their homes. This shifted the entire social fabric of the era. People who had once worked on their own schedules in their own kitchens, pausing to tend to their children or their gardens, were now working in shifts under the watchful eye of an overseer. The quiet, rural life of the spinning wheel was being replaced by the loud, urban roar of the mill. This was not just a change in technology, It was a change in how humans experienced time and community. The clock became the master of the day, and the machine became the center of the household. The scaling of the textile industry also forced people to think about standards and quality in a new way. When you are spinning by hand, every inch of thread is a little bit different because it depends on the mood and the fatigue of the person making it. A person might spin tightly in the morning and loosely in the afternoon as they grow tired. But a machine is consistent. It pulls the fiber with the same force every time, regardless of the hour. This consistency allowed for the creation of much finer and stronger fabrics than had ever been possible on a mass scale. It meant that a person in one town could buy a piece of cloth and know exactly what they were getting, because the process had been standardized by the gears and carriages of the machine. The concept of the reliable, mass-produced good was being born. Economically, this was an explosion. The cost of clothing plummeted, and for the first time in history, regular people could afford to own more than 1 or 2 outfits. Before this, clothing was a major capital investment that was often passed down in wills. Now it was becoming a commodity. The textile industry became the engine of the global economy, driving trade, shipping, and even the development of other technologies like the steam engine. The demand for more cotton to feed these machines had massive and often dark consequences for the rest of the world, shaping the politics and labor systems of entire continents as they scrambled to provide the raw materials for the English mills. It proved that a single technical change in a small English village could ripple outward until it touched every corner of the globe, reshaping the lives of people thousands of miles away. Why does this story still matter to us today? We are currently living through another era of massive automation. Just as the spinning jenny replaced the hand of the spinner, we are seeing software and robotics replace tasks that we once thought only humans could do. The fears of the workers in the 1760s are the same fears we hear today about artificial intelligence and automated factories. We worry about being replaced by something that does not tire and does not make mistakes. The spinning jenny reminds us that technology always creates a trade-off. It brings incredible abundance and makes things possible that were once dreams. But it also disrupts lives and forces us to rethink how we value work. It forces us to ask what it means to be a productive member of society when a machine can do our job 10 times better and faster. The spinning jenny was the spark that lit the fuse of the Industrial Revolution. It proved that we could use our minds to build tools that overcame our physical limitations. It took a process that was slow, manual, and localized, and turned it into something fast, mechanical, and global. It was the moment humanity decided that instead of just working harder, we were going to work smarter by building machines that could keep up with our ambitions. It was the transition from a world of biological limits to a world of mechanical possibilities. We stopped being limited by the strength of our arms and started being limited only by the complexity of our designs. This breakthrough in manufacturing was only the beginning of a chain reaction. Once you can make thousands of pounds of cloth in a single factory, you face a new, even bigger problem of how to get that product to the people who want to buy it. Producing the goods was only half the battle. Moving them across a world that still relied on horses and muddy tracks was the next great hurdle. The bottleneck had shifted from the spinning wheel to the muddy, slow roads of the countryside. In the next episode, we will move forward to 1825 and explore how canals and civil engineering logistics changed the stakes by solving the problem of distance. If you enjoyed this look at the foundations of industry, follow along as we continue to track the breakthroughs that built our modern world.